Hello, my name is Emily Nordman, and in this talk, I'm going to present some exploratory mixed methods work that we did looking at test anxiety for exams that have been moved online due to the COVID restrictions. So test anxiety manifests through affective, behavioral, and cognitive components. For example, feeling faint, feeling worried and stressed, and also things like procrastination. And unsurprisingly, very high levels of test anxiety have been shown to negatively affect performance. However, similar to the Yerkes-Dodson anxiety curve, there's also evidence of a zone of optimal functioning, which is the idea that a little bit of anxiety is good for us. So too little test anxiety or too little or too high test anxiety affects performance, but a certain amount is actually good. There are several frameworks and models of test anxiety, but the lens that we chose to conduct our research through was the learning testing cycle by Cassidy, which discusses the impact of test anxiety on each stage of the testing process, so preparation, performance, and reflection. Pre-COVID, one study found that although students performed slightly better in online exams, 87% still preferred face-to-face exams, a finding that's probably due to familiarity with the format. Additionally, concern over access to reliable technology can increase test anxiety for online exams. Although on the flip side, Williams and Wong argue that online exams are more authentic because by their nature, they tend to be open book, and it actually leads to improved learning outcomes and reduced test anxiety. Of course, in our current context, what we've seen is this massive shift across the entire sector. Every course, every type of exam has been moved online. And then in addition to that, there's also the wider impact of the pandemic, generally higher levels of stress, anxiety, and depression, a worry about the efficacy of online learning and teaching, as well as very high numbers of students reporting difficulties concentrating, partially driven by the home environment being so distracting. Given all of these factors, we decided to take an exploratory mixed methods approach. We were interested not only in what's happened since COVID hit with exams and anxiety, but looking forward, thinking about how we can best design exams in the new normal. The pandemic is not going away anywhere near as quickly as anyone was hoping, but there are also pedagogical arguments that means that a lot of these online exams are probably here to stay. So our first study took a qualitative approach. We conducted 15 semi-structured interviews with undergraduate students who are either in their final year who had just recently graduated, and they had also taken online exams in summer 2020. The questions were based around the learning testing cycle, so preparation, performance, and reflection, but we also asked participants to think ahead to the future exams and what they would change. And because we were interested in individual experiences, we chose IPA as the qualitative analysis method. This is going to be an absolutely whistle-stop tour of the interview because of time, but I am happy to come back to any of this in the questions. The first theme centered around the environment. So participants talked about the impact of working from home. And although there were a couple of positive experiences, we saw a lot of the struggles that we've heard so much about. And this was also described in terms of a lack of academic cues. So it wasn't just that working at home presented logistical difficulties and resource difficulties. It was that the absence of the usual environmental cues, like, being in the library, being in the exam hall, that lack of separation between home and study, it made it much, much harder to get into the right frame of mind to do effective studying and to perform well in exams. Perhaps the most interesting thing to come out of this theme for me was the idea that online exams remove a social component. As this participant put it, there was no shared stress. And that was a bad thing, because you couldn't look around and see that everyone else was stressed as well, that it was kind of a normal thing. It wasn't just you. Regarding the exam format, there were two main sub-themes. First, there was a mixed response to the impact of online exams that had been turned into extended, flexible exams, so 24 or 48 hours, for example. There were positive experiences of students reporting, these allowed them to take a break and give them just more time generally. But also that these kind of exams just extended the period that they were anxious, and that in some ways it actually adversely affected their concentration. They would justify not working as hard and not focusing as much because they had so much time. All students in this study had experienced open book exams, and most of them talked about how this had changed their study habits. There were a number of students who described really positive shifts, so moving their revision strategies away from rote memorization towards understanding the material and having better notes to work from. However, there were also a lot of mentions of reduced preparation and this perception that open book exams don't require any preparation. And we saw a real kind of lack of distinction between memorization and true knowledge and understanding. It didn't seem to distinguish these two things that well. The third theme concerned the timeline of anxiety. And probably one of the strongest messages that came from all of the interviews was that these extended flexible exams invoked much less anxiety, but that actually this was perceived as a reduction in useful pressure. Many participants described face-to-face exams as more stressful at the time, but that they were also very aware that it was the stress that made them perform. And there were also several mentions of the cathartic nature of having a set time to finish the exam. You build it up and then it's a set time to finish it. And again, making reference to this social component of, finishing at the same time as everybody else. And that the extended nature of the flexible exams made them in some ways more stressful because they didn't know when to stop and that they would overthink their answers. Unsurprisingly, many participants also spoke about how their experience of studying exams was influenced by external anxieties. COVID, obviously, but also in the UK, COVID hit just after an extended period of industrial action. So many students hadn't really had much teaching contact since 2019, and they've just given up. The final theme was communication and expectations, and this really focused on the messages that academic staff were giving. First, a number of participants reported that they felt like the expectations for online exams were unclear, and this was particularly framed in reference with comparison with face-to-face timed exams. So one student said that the expected word count for the open book exams was so much higher, but there wasn't really much else to help guide them about what they should use that word count for. So they just ignored it because it made them too anxious. So they just followed the guidance that they would have done in the old exams. A second theme was about consistency. Again, a number of students talked about feeling, that the differences between exams on different courses wasn't fair, or they had different expectations for different courses and different kinds of online exams, which provoked anxiety and made it difficult to know what to do. And there was also a sense of unfairness that some courses would give students 5 days for an exam, whilst others had, 1 day. They didn't think it was potentially helpful to have more time, but there was this inconsistency and unfairness. Finally, there was also a common belief that marking had been influenced by the format of the exams, and this went both ways. So if they did better than expected, they attributed it to their marker going easy because of the pandemic. And if they did worse than expected, they attributed it to the marker being harsher because of the online format. The external attribution, the reflection, was very much focused on factors out with their control. Study 2 was a larger quantitative survey study. So we had 280 UK students respond. There were 5 sections, so demographics, a COVID anxiety scale. We asked about the type of exam that they'd taken, a test anxiety scale, and then exam format preference. So thinking ahead, what would they like to see? Again, a whistle-stop tour of the results, and I'm just going to present the descriptive data here from really the final section. So the students were asked which type of exam, face-to-face, online, or no preference, they felt better able to prepare for, perform better in, felt more anxious, and which one they would choose given the option. And what we can see here is that this supports really, I think, the qualitative analysis. Students report feeling much less anxious during online exams compared to face-to-face, but actually this doesn't translate into feeling more prepared for the exams or really performing that much better in them. And when it comes down to which option they choose, it's fairly split. What's really interesting, though, is when you break these preferences down by the type of exam students had experience. So for preparation, there's not much going on between those who took fully flexible exams, those who took flexible timed exams. So you have 24 hours, but from the moment you start the exam, it's timed and you have 2 hours, or fully timed exams, all students sitting it at the same time. So yeah, in terms of preparation, not a huge amount going on, a slight preference for face-to-face. But if we look at performance here, you can see basically there's this massive reversal in the pattern depending upon the type of exam. Those students who had fully flexible exams showed a strong preference to go back to face-to-face, whereas those students who'd had flexible timed exams were saying, keeping the online, that they felt that they performed better in the online. And for timed exams, again, a preference for online exams, but not quite as strong. In terms of anxiety, students who had sat both types of flexible online exams strongly reported face-to-face produced more anxiety, whereas with timed exams, it's still definitely face-to-face coming out on top, but it is a different race. And finally, when asked to choose which option they would choose going forward, we see a combination of these results. Those who had done flexible exams would prefer to go back to face-to-face. Those who had done flexible timed exams would choose online. And for timed exams, it was an even split. Very brief limitations. The qualitative analysis so far was conducted by my undergraduate dissertation student, Caitlin Turner. I actually think this is a strength and she did a fantastic job. But the data do also need an academic perspective, given the intention to use this to inform academic choices. The quantitative analysis is purely descriptive. This is partially because the older and more cynical I get, the less I think p-values and inferential statistics have any place in this kind of work. But it's also partially because some of the adaptations that were made to the anxiety scales mean that they may not be psychometrically valid. So I don't think we can use the full data set. And of course, this is all self-report. With those caveats in mind, what does this tell us? First, I think the highlight is that our focus shouldn't be online versus face-to-face exams. It should be, are they timed or flexible? What comes out really strongly across both studies is that the decisions about timing are key. Open book is more authentic. It seems to produce some better learning behaviors, but potentially the combination with time pressure would be better. Second, and related, test anxiety reduction in itself is not a useful goal. And it really comes back to this idea of the zone of optimal functioning. There's often a push, trying to be more inclusive and more accessible, to be more and more flexible, but actually that's potentially not always that helpful and can cause other problems. Third, we need to consider the importance of psychological and social cues with exams. Being in an academic environment, taking this exam at the same time as everybody else, that catharsis, that has benefits. What we should be trying to do in the new normal is to think about how we can combine those cues and the pressure from traditional exams that's helpful with the authenticity and flexibility of open book online exams. What's clear is that whatever we do, expectation setting is going to be key. And this goes for both reducing anxiety from ensuring students knows what is expected of them, but also actually in some cases, increasing anxiety to that useful level. If students aren't preparing for open book exams, that's partially on us to ensure that they understand what it is and why it is that not preparing for open book will still negatively impact performance. Thank you very much.